energy technologies, like all new technologies, replaced older technologies because they were cheaper or for some other reason better in terms of making our lives better. And I think we need to think about the transition to clean energy in the same way. The good news is that we have a lot of experience making things cheap. That's what we do with our technologies. So if we just think about here in the United States, the personal computer wouldn't have existed had we not made microchips much cheaper. In the early 50s, microchips cost about $1,000 a chip. The Defense Department bought so many of them that the price came down to just $20 a chip. The federal government does all sorts of investments to help the economy grow and to make technologies cheap. We invented the railroads, the interstate highway system, we built the electric grid, and we've got a new challenge now that's going to require a similar kind of investment. Al Gore has talked about the need to get to 100% clean energy in 10 years. I think we would say that our goal should be, let's make clean energy cheap as quickly as possible so that the whole world can move to cheaper, cleaner sources of energy. So how do we do this? Well, there's really three key steps. The first is that we need to double or maybe triple the amount of money that we spend on R&D. We spend about $4 billion a year on energy R&D, which is a joke. That's less than Amgen, one biotechnology firm, spends on all of its R&D. The second thing we need to do is that we need to invest in the infrastructure to allow clean energy sources to take hold. So, for example, if we invested about $60 billion in building new transmission lines from the windy Dakotas and other windy parts of the United States, private firms could build wind turbines in those areas and transport clean energy to the cities and other factories. Other infrastructure investments could include transmission lines from sunny areas like Arizona and Southern California so that private companies and others could build solar thermal plants and other solar factories to bring clean energy to the cities and to factories. And the third thing, and maybe the most important thing, is that the government just needs to make large contracts with private companies to make and manufacture clean energy. And so when we think about technology innovation, how do we get these big breakthroughs? We often think of guys like Edison working in their laboratory, inventing the light bulb, or sort of being a genius by yourself or with a team like the Manhattan Project where they invented the nuclear bomb. But most technology innovation actually happens in the real world. You have to build a lot of this stuff in order to figure out how to make it cheaper. So for example, the United States had great investments in the R&D for solar and wind, but it failed to actually hire private companies to build the solar panels and the wind turbines. And as a result, we lost those industries to Japan and Denmark in the 1990s. Well, what happened? Well, Denmark decided to use all of its revenue from a carbon tax that it put in place in the early 90s to build larger and larger wind turbines offshore where the winds were stronger. The result was that Denmark ended up dominating the wind industry in the 1990s, creating a multi-billion-dollar investment. The government more than made up for its early investment in those wind turbines. It couldn't have happened if you hadn't had Danish engineers out there in the real world building these turbines, getting them going, and figuring out how to make them cheaper and cheaper so that they could eventually become cost competitive with other fossil fuel energy sources like natural gas. Similarly, in Japan, they knew that if they wanted to make solar panels cheaper, they had to just start installing them and getting their factories making cheaper and cheaper solar panels. And so what we saw was the Japanese government working with private companies to manufacture next generation solar panels and getting huge price declines. These are called learning curves, and you can track them over time as we get better at making new technologies, whether it's microchips or personal computers or cell phones or solar panels or wind turbines. The learning curves improve and the prices come down. So our immodest proposal is that we make a $50 billion investment annually for the next 20 and maybe 30 years to make clean energy cheap and establish a competitive, vibrant industry in the United States and in other parts of the world to sell these clean energy sources to the 2 billion and other poorest people in the world who right now are energy poor. And the model for all of this is not so much past pollution regulation efforts, but really the creation of the EU, which after World War II, Winston Churchill went to the United States and gave a speech here in St. Louis, and he also gave a speech in Zurich, where he called for the United States of Europe. He said, not only do we need to rebuild Europe, but we need to create a common economic community where we have a win-win in terms of our trade and manufacturing. And he got the United States so excited that we invested $500 billion in today's dollars into this effort to rebuild Europe and Japan. And the whole initiative was called the European Coal and Steel Community. It was an effort based on energy and manufacturing, and it achieved exactly what Churchill envisioned. And today the European Union is the most vibrant economic entity in the world. We think we need to do the same thing today on clean energy. And that alliance should include Europe, the United States, Canada, Japan, the wealthy countries of the world, working with the two giants of the developing world, China and India. And if we were to, the wealthy countries, pool our resources, 50 billion from the United States, 50 billion from Europe, 10 or 15 billion from Canada and Japan, we'd have 100 or 120 billion to invest every year in manufacturing solar panels and making wind turbines even cheaper and inventing breakthrough new technologies that we can't even imagine. If we made those kinds of investments over the next 10 or 20 years, I think we would see a revolution in our energy technologies. We would start to see our emissions decline dramatically, I think in time to prevent catastrophic global warming. And we would also lift up the poorest people in the world to join modern life and live healthier, freer, and happier lives. That's the kind of vision that we think has the potential to really take off in a time of economic crisis and be something that all of us, not just Americans and not just those of us that are concerned about climate change, can get excited about.